The sound of soft whimpers guided Mira through the thick forest as the evening fog began to roll in. She walked slowly, flashlight in hand, her boots crunching over fallen leaves and broken twigs. The villagers had reported strange cries coming from near an old abandoned cabin. Sounds, they said, belonged to something wild and lost. Mira had seen many things during her years as a wildlife rescue officer, but this night felt different. The air was heavy, the forest too quiet, as if holding its breath. When she finally reached the cabin, the cries grew clearer, not angry growls, but frightened, hungry sounds. She pushed open the creaking door, and the beam of her flashlight landed on 3 small shapes huddled near a broken chair. Wolf cubs. Their fur was matted, ribs showing through thin skin, eyes bright with fear. One of them bared tiny teeth, growling weakly to protect the scraps of food scattered on the ground, a piece of bark, an old bone, nothing worth defending. Mira slowly knelt, setting her bag down without making sudden moves. "It's okay," she whispered softly, though she knew they didn't understand her words. Still, her voice carried warmth, something gentle that didn't belong in a place so cold. The cubs didn't move. One trembled, another whimpered, and the third tried to stand, but stumbled. They were too young to survive on their own, too wild to accept help. Myra looked around the dark room, claw marks on the floor, an empty corner where their mother might have sheltered them once. She sighed, realizing what must have happened. Their mother was gone, maybe caught in a trap, maybe scared away by humans. These little ones had been fighting to stay alive, surviving on instinct alone. Mira reached slowly into her bag and took out a small piece of cooked meat she'd brought for emergencies. She placed it on the floor a few feet away and stepped back, sitting cross-legged to make herself seem smaller. The cubs watched her warily. One sniffed the air, inching forward, every movement tense with caution. Then, finally, hunger won over fear. The smallest cub grabbed the meat and darted back, chewing quickly. Mira didn't move. She just smiled faintly, whispering again, "Good job, little one." For a moment, she saw something change in their eyes, the glimmer of curiosity breaking through their confusion. They were not cruel, not dangerous, just scared. Born predators, yes, but right now, they were only children lost in a world that didn't forgive weakness. Mira knew she couldn't leave them here. As the wind howled through the broken windows, and the forest grew darker, she made her decision. These cubs would not die alone. She opened her jacket, wrapping it gently around a small cage she had brought, and whispered to the shadows, "You're safe now." It wasn't just a promise to them, it was a promise to herself. For Mira, every rescue wasn't about taming the wild. It was about proving that, even in fear, kindness could still be stronger. The cabin was silent, except for the faint sound of the wind slipping through broken boards. Mira sat cross-legged on the cold floor, her flashlight dimmed to a soft glow. In front of her, a few feet away, she had placed small pieces of food, cooked meat, still warm from the pack she carried. The 3 wolf cubs stayed huddled together in the corner, their tiny bodies shaking from both fear and exhaustion. Their golden eyes watched her every move. One growled softly, a sound more pitiful than threatening. Mira didn't flinch. She simply waited, her hands resting on her knees, her voice low and calm. "It's okay," she murmured. "No one's going to hurt you." Time moved slowly, marked only by the dripping of water from a cracked roof beam. Mira's legs ached from sitting still, but she didn't move. She knew that with wild creatures, patience wasn't optional, it was everything. Any sudden gesture, any rush of emotion, could turn fear into chaos. So she waited, letting the cubs watch her breathe, blink, and exist without danger. Hours passed like that, the woman and the 3 wild hearts locked in a quiet standoff. The smallest cub began to twitch its nose. Hunger was stronger than fear now. It sniffed the air, then looked at its siblings, who stayed frozen in place. The scent of food drifted toward them, warm and tempting. Mira saw the hesitation in its movements, the way it would take one small step forward, then freeze, listening for danger. She didn't move, not even her eyes. Her only response was a soft whisper, almost like a lullaby carried on the air. "You're safe. Go on." Finally, after what felt like forever, the cub crept forward. Each paw landed carefully, its body low to the ground, ready to retreat at the slightest sign of threat. It reached the food, sniffed once, twice, then snatched a piece and darted back. The sound of chewing filled the silence. Myra smiled faintly but didn't celebrate. She knew this wasn't trust. Not yet. This was instinct, survival. But it was something. It was the first time the cubs had chosen to take from her hand, the first time they didn't see her as a predator. As the night deepened, the cub finished eating and looked at her again. There was no growl this time, just curiosity. Myra's heart softened at the sight. She didn't reach out, didn't ruin the fragile piece. She simply whispered, "You did well." The other two cubs, still unsure, pressed closer to the smallest one, sniffing its fur, as if to ask whether it was safe. That small act, the taking of food, the absence of fear, became a silent bridge between two worlds. Myra understood that trust wasn't something you earned quickly. It was built, breath by breath, through stillness, patience, and respect. That night, as the storm outside began to fade, something else stirred quietly inside that ruined cabin. The beginning of a bond that neither human nor predator had expected. When Myra finally carried the cubs out of the forest, dawn was breaking. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke from distant villages. The cubs, wrapped in a soft blanket, whimpered quietly but didn't fight her anymore. She could feel their trembling bodies against her chest, fragile and wild, hearts beating fast. At the rescue center, other staff members gathered, surprised to see her cradling the small creatures so carefully. "They're too young," one said. "Too wild," said another. Some suggested locking them in isolation, away from humans and noise, to prevent them from becoming dangerous later. But Mira shook her head firmly. "They've had enough fear," she said softly. "They need calm, not cages." She set up a quiet corner in the shelter's back room, a place with soft straw, dim light, and the sound of water dripping from a small pipe. Every few hours, she would bring food and sit silently beside their enclosure. At first, the cubs reacted the way wild things do, growling, snapping at the bowls, eyes wide with suspicion. They didn't understand her calm voice or her slow movements. They only knew survival, hunger, and fear, but Mira never rushed them. She placed the food down and waited, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, until the cubs gathered enough courage to eat. Days turned into weeks, and her routine never changed. She spoke softly each time she entered, her tone steady and warm. The cubs began to recognize her scent, the faint smell of soap, forest, and metal from her tools. They began to know her footsteps too, the gentle rhythm that meant food, warmth, and no harm. Their growls became shorter, less sharp. They still watched her carefully, but something new started to grow in their eyes, not fear, but curiosity. One afternoon, when the rain was falling softly outside, Myra noticed the middle cub take a step closer than usual. It sniffed the air near her hand, but didn't bite. She didn't move. She just smiled and let the cub decide. Then another followed, brushing its nose against the bowl she held. It was a small moment, almost nothing, but for her, it was everything. It meant they were beginning to trust that not every touch meant danger, not every shadow meant pain. At night, when the center went quiet, Myra would sit by their enclosure and whisper stories, not for them to understand her words, but to hear her tone, the gentle rise and fall of a voice that meant safety. She knew she couldn't force trust. It had to grow like light in darkness, slow and steady, and though the cubs were still wild, their eyes no longer held only fear. They were learning that patience could protect and gentleness could heal. And Mira, watching them drift to sleep, felt something she hadn't in years, the quiet joy of seeing wild hearts begin to believe in kindness again. The days passed slowly, marked by the soft rhythm of routine, feeding, cleaning, waiting, and learning. The cubs, once fierce and frightened, began to change in small but beautiful ways. Myra never forced them to obey. Instead, she showed them what peace looked like. Each morning, she entered their pen with calm footsteps, speaking gently so they knew she was near. The cubs would lift their heads, eyes alert but no longer wild with fear. They had learned the sound of her voice meant safety, not danger. Mealtime became their silent lesson. Mira placed 3 bowls of food on the ground, always in the same order, always with patience. At first, the cubs fought, snapping and growling over the first bowl they could reach. But Mira never shouted or struck them. She simply waited, her quiet presence breaking through the chaos. Then she started something new. Every evening, before feeding them, she sat beside their enclosure with her own bowl of soup. The cubs watched, puzzled at first. She ate slowly, without looking at them, her calmness filling the room like a soft hum. It wasn't dominance she was teaching, it was stillness. She wanted them to see that eating didn't have to mean fighting, that peace could exist even during hunger. Slowly, something in them shifted. The next evening, the cubs didn't rush forward. They sat, watching her, their breathing steady. Mira smiled quietly and blew gently on her hot soup before taking another bite. The sound of her breath, soft, human, steady, became a signal. It told them everything was okay. When she finally slid the bowls toward them, they didn't lunge. They waited. One cub, the smallest, tilted its head, as if mimicking her calm motion. Another pawed lightly at the floor, but stayed still. It was a miracle of patience, the wild learning from the gentle. The cubs, once driven by instinct alone, were beginning to understand something beyond instinct, trust. As days turned into weeks, Mira's routine became sacred. The cubs would gather near the edge of their pen every evening, waiting for the sound of her whistle, a soft 2-note call that meant dinner time. They no longer growled. Instead, they sat quietly, tails twitching, eyes following her every move. Their wild energy was still there, but it had been reshaped into something softer, something that connected them to her. One night, as the wind howled outside the rescue center, Myra looked at them and realized how far they had come. The same cubs who once bit at bowls now waited for her to eat first. They trusted her rhythm, her breath, her way of showing peace. It wasn't just training, it was a bond. And as she watched them finish their meal in silence, she whispered to herself, they weren't born cruel. They just needed someone to show them gentleness. In that moment, the wild and the human were no longer separate. They shared the same calm heartbeat, echoing softly in the quiet room. That night, the sky tore open with thunder. The wind howled through the trees, rain slashing against the windows of the rescue center. The cubs, once proud and wild, huddled together in their corner. Every flash of lightning made them flinch. Every roll of thunder drew frightened whimpers from their throats. Mira stood by the door, her heart aching. She had seen fear before, in people, in animals, but this was different. These cubs, born predators, were trembling like children in the dark. She walked closer, speaking softly over the roar of the storm. It's all right. It's just noise, she whispered. But the cubs didn't understand words. They understood tone. Her calm voice was steady, like a thread pulling them toward safety. The smallest cub pressed its nose against the bars, its wide eyes reflecting a flash of lightning. Mira saw the panic in its gaze, and knew this was the moment that could change everything, if she acted with care. Slowly, she knelt down near the door, keeping her movements quiet. The cubs didn't growl this time. They only stared, frozen between fear and trust. Myra slid the latch halfway open, just enough for her hand to fit through the gap. Her heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. "It's okay," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she reached out. The air was cold, the smell of rain filling the room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, to her surprise, one cub stepped forward. It didn't snarl or bare its teeth. It simply lowered its head, slowly, carefully. It pressed its forehead against her open palm. The warmth of its fur, the trembling of its small body. It was real, fragile, and full of trust. Mira didn't move. She let the cub stay there, feeling its heartbeat against her hand. The storm raged on outside, but inside, a different kind of storm had ended. The cub was no longer afraid. Not of her, not of the world beyond the bars. One by one, the others crept closer, drawn by the calm. They didn't touch her yet, but they didn't hide either. The wall between them, built by instinct and fear, began to crumble. Minutes passed before the cub pulled away, blinking sleepily. Mira closed the latch gently and sat down beside the cage. She watched as the cubs curled together, their bodies relaxed for the first time since she found them. A faint smile touched her lips. That single moment, one touch, one act of trust, had done what weeks of feeding and waiting could not. From that night on, everything changed. The cubs no longer saw Mira as a stranger or a threat. When she entered the room, they no longer growled. They came closer, curious, hopeful. The storm outside had frightened them, but it had also given them a gift, the courage to reach out. And for Mira, that single touch became a quiet promise that no heart, no matter how wild, stays untamed forever when met with kindness. The morning began like any other sunlight pouring through the windows. The smell of damp earth after rain, and the soft sound of cubs playing near the gate. Mira sat on the ground, sketching notes about their feeding habits, when a sharp knock echoed through the rescue center. Standing at the door was a man in a government uniform, his face stern and unreadable. He introduced himself as an inspector sent to review the center's wildlife handling practices. Mira welcomed him politely, unaware that his visit would soon shake the fragile peace she had built. He walked through the enclosures, clipboard in hand, eyes cold and precise. When he stopped at the cub's cage, they looked up curiously. One of them, the smallest, gave a soft whine, a sound of recognition, as if expecting Mira to follow. The inspector frowned. "They don't behave like wild wolves," he said flatly. "They look at humans as if they belong here." Myra felt a knot tighten in her chest. "They've been through trauma," she explained. "They're not pets. They're learning to feel safe again." But the man shook his head. "You're making them too human," he said, his voice carrying judgment more than concern. He turned to her with a firm tone. "These animals must be released back into the wild. The department can't risk them losing their natural instincts." His words landed like stones. Mira stood silent, her heart heavy. She had spent months teaching the cubs patience, trust, and peace, and now she was being told it was wrong. "They're not ready," she argued. "They still rely on humans for food and care. Out there they'll be hunted or starve." The inspector's expression didn't change. "Rules are rules. You have 1 week to prepare them for release." After he left, the room felt colder. The cubs, unaware of what had just happened, tugged at her sleeves playfully. Mira tried to smile, but her hands trembled. She looked at them, their bright eyes, their growing strength, and wondered if teaching them kindness had doomed them. Could the wild accept creatures who had learned to wait their turn, to trust a human hand? That night, she sat alone beside their enclosure. The moonlight fell across the floor, silver and soft. The cubs were asleep, huddled together like before. Myra whispered into the quiet, "You were never meant to be tame. But I wanted you to know peace, not fear. The thought of losing them felt unbearable. Yet she knew she couldn't defy the order without risking their safety and her job. Still, deep inside, a quiet resolve grew. She would not let them go unprepared. If they had to return to the wild, she would make sure they carried something stronger than instinct, a memory of care, a trace of light in their wild hearts. The challenge was set, and Mira knew this final week would decide whether her bond with them had been a mistake or a miracle. The morning of the test arrived with a quiet stillness that seemed to hang over the rescue center like a heavy blanket. Mira woke before dawn, her heart uneasy, yet determined. Today she would see if the cubs were truly ready to live without her. She loaded the truck with a few supplies, meat for bait, water, and tracking collars, and then carefully guided the 3 wolf cubs into their transport crates. They no longer snarled or whined when separated from her. Instead, they sat alert, curious about what lay ahead. The drive to the reserve was long and winding, with trees growing thicker and the road fading into gravel. Myra kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the shadows of the cubs shift inside their cages. When she reached the fenced reserve, the air felt different, wilder, freer. The land stretched wide with tall grass and scattered rocks, and in the distance, the faint sound of running water echoed through the valley. This was where nature decided who survived and who didn't. Myra's hands trembled as she unlocked the first cage. The cub hesitated, sniffing the air before stepping out cautiously. The others followed, their paws pressing into real soil for the first time since they were rescued. They sniffed the wind, ears twitching, eyes bright with curiosity. Mira stood a few steps away, silent, resisting the urge to call them back. The cubs began to explore. They nipped at each other playfully, rolled in the grass, and followed the scents that the forest offered. Every movement was a test. Could they listen to their instincts? Could they find courage without her voice guiding them? Myra watched as the largest cub stopped near a small mound of dirt and began to dig, unearthing a hidden scent. The smallest one, once the most fearful, chased a butterfly, its tail wagging softly. For the first time, Mira saw not orphans, but young predators rediscovering who they were meant to be. Then, she called out softly, not a command, just their familiar sound, a short whistle she had used since day one. All 3 cubs paused, their heads turned toward her in unison. For a long moment, their eyes met, hers filled with quiet pride, theirs reflecting something that went beyond dependence. It was not fear or confusion, it was understanding. They recognized her, not as their leader, but as the one who had shown them gentleness in a world that demanded strength. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying her scent away as they turned back toward the open field. Myra's heart ached, but it also swelled with peace. They were learning to belong to the wild again, and yet, some part of her would always belong with them. She whispered into the wind, "Go on. The world is yours now." The cubs continued forward, confident and free, while Mira stood behind the fence, watching as the bond they shared transformed from need into respect. It wasn't a farewell. It was a silent promise that love, once given, never truly leaves. It just changes shape. The morning of the release arrived with a mist that hugged the forest floor, quiet and silver under the early sun. Myra didn't sleep much the night before. She sat beside the cubs' pen, listening to their soft breathing, wondering if they understood what was about to happen. The world outside the rescue center was wild, unpredictable, and often cruel, yet it was where they truly belonged. As the first light touched the trees, she loaded them carefully into the truck, each in a separate crate, lined with the blankets they'd grown up with. They didn't struggle or growl now. They simply watched her with calm, trusting eyes that made the moment even harder. The drive felt longer than usual, the road narrowing until it was little more than a dirt path winding through thick green forest. The birds were just beginning to wake, their songs breaking the silence in soft bursts. Mira parked the truck near a river clearing, where the air smelled of pine and earth. This was the perfect place, far from human settlements, full of prey, water, and shelter. She opened the back of the truck and stood there for a moment, her hands resting on the latch of the first cage. Her heart thudded as she whispered softly, "It's time." One by one, she opened the doors. The cubs didn't rush out. They blinked at the sunlight, sniffed the air, and stepped out carefully, their paws sinking into the damp soil. They looked so different now, taller, stronger, their fur thick and gleaming. The forest was quiet, almost as if it too was watching this moment. The cubs spread out slowly, testing the space, their instincts pulling them toward freedom. Yet they didn't run. They stayed close, glancing back at Mira, uncertain. She knelt down, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Go on, you're ready?" The smallest cub, the one who had always clung closest to her, turned back one last time. It walked up to her slowly, its golden eyes steady and calm. Then, without hesitation, it pressed its nose gently against her hand, a simple touch that spoke more than words ever could. It was gratitude. It was farewell. It was love, wild and pure. Mira felt the warmth of its breath for a moment, before it turned and ran into the trees, its siblings following closely behind. She stayed there long after they disappeared, the forest swallowing their soft footfalls. The wind moved through the trees, brushing against her cheeks like a whisper. For the first time, she didn't feel loss. She felt peace. Teaching them gentleness had not made them weak. It had given them strength to face a world that often knew only fear. They had learned to trust, to love, and to survive without losing their hearts. And as Mira stood there in the quiet forest, she smiled through her tears, knowing that somewhere beyond the trees, 3 wolves carried her kindness into the wild. Months passed after the release, and life at the rescue center slowly returned to its routine. But for Mira, something always felt missing, a quiet space in her heart that only the cubs had filled. She often wondered if they had survived, if they still remembered her, or if the wild had fully claimed them. Then, one crisp evening, an assignment brought her back to the same forest where she had let them go. She was there for research, to study predator movements and help track animal patterns for conservation. Yet, deep down, she knew she wanted more than data. She wanted to see a sign, any sign, that her cubs were still out there. The forest looked both familiar and new. The trees seemed taller, their roots deeper. The air carried the scent of moss and rain, the same smell that had surrounded her the day she'd said goodbye. Mira set up camp near the riverbank where she had first released them. The fire crackled softly as night fell, and the chorus of crickets filled the silence between her thoughts. She sat close to the fire, sipping warm tea, her flashlight beside her, when she heard it, a long, distant howl that echoed through the valley. It wasn't the cry of a wild predator staking territory. It was softer, steadier, and strangely familiar. Her heart began to race. She turned off her light, listening carefully. Then another sound followed, the rustle of leaves, the quiet pad of footsteps approaching through the dark. Mira froze, but didn't reach for her weapon. Instead, she whispered into the night, "It's okay." The shadows between the trees shifted, and slowly, a large wolf stepped into the glow of her firelight. Its fur shimmered silver under the moon, its eyes steady and calm. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Mira noticed something else. It wasn't baring its teeth, wasn't growling or tense. It was simply watching her, with quiet recognition, the same way it had done months ago when she taught it to trust. The wolf stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. In its mouth, it carried a rabbit, freshly caught. Gently, it placed the rabbit on the ground near her campfire, then sat down, tail brushing the dirt. Mira's throat tightened as she understood it wasn't hunting, it was offering. It was a gift, a thank you, a bridge between their worlds. Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered softly, "You remember." For a moment, The forest felt sacred, a place where love and wildness could exist together. The wolf stood again, looked at her one last time, then turned and disappeared into the trees, its form melting into the darkness like mist. Mira sat by the fire long after it was gone, the untouched rabbit beside her, her heart full. She realized that what she had given those cubs wasn't just survival, it was humanity. And tonight, the wild had returned that gift. Wrapped in silence and grace, years passed since the night in the forest when the grown wolf had returned to Mira with a silent thank you. Time moved on, but that moment stayed in her heart, shaping everything she did afterward. At the rescue center, Mira began to train new officers and volunteers, not just in animal handling, but in understanding. She called her way of working the gentle rehabilitation method. Instead of teaching fear, she taught patience. Instead of showing control, she showed respect. Many people doubted her at first. They said wild creatures only understood dominance, not kindness. But Mira quietly proved them wrong, one rescued animal at a time. She worked with wolves, foxes, even birds of prey, all creatures once considered too dangerous or too wild to reform. Her calm voice and steady presence became her greatest tools. She never raised her hand in anger or forced an animal into submission. She simply gave them the space to trust again. Slowly, her approach started to gain attention. Wildlife officers from across the region came to watch her work. They saw her kneel beside growling animals, whispering softly, and somehow, the growling stopped. They saw creatures that had known only fear start to respond to her warmth. People began to realize that she wasn't just rescuing animals. She was rewriting the way humans connected with nature. As years went by, the wolves she had once saved thrived in the wild. Researchers tracking them noticed something unusual. Unlike other packs, this one rarely attacked livestock or fought over territory. They had built a kind of balance, a quiet order, that puzzled even the experts. One scientist described them as the calmest predators ever recorded. For Mira, the news brought tears to her eyes. They hadn't forgotten her lessons. They hadn't lost their strength or instincts. They had learned how to use them differently. They had chosen peace, not weakness. Mira's story began spreading beyond the rescue world. Documentaries, magazines, and schools began to talk about her method. She was invited to speak at wildlife forums, where she always said the same simple truth: fear teaches survival. Compassion teaches life. Her message reached far more than just animal workers. Parents, teachers, and ordinary people started using her philosophy in their own lives, to listen more, to judge less, to be patient with what they didn't understand. On the 10th anniversary of her first rescue, Mira visited the same forest once again. The air was cool, the trees golden with autumn leaves. She stood by the clearing where she had first found the orphaned cubs. A faint howl echoed in the distance, not one of hunger or threat, but of peace. Mira smiled through tears, whispering into the wind, "You did it." In that moment, she understood her legacy wasn't written in books or awards. It lived in the forest, carried by the very creatures who once learned from her heart. Compassion had changed them, and through them, it had changed the world.